All right, this is my presentation on Bush, the Downing Street Memo, and the turning point in U.S. foreign policy. Before we get started really quick, I'd just like to point out these individuals that I have at the bottom of our screen. These are going to be very important characters going forward. We obviously have former President George Bush. We have his Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and Associate Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz. So, setting the scene for this whole situation, you have to think back to the wake of 9/11. Following the most deadly terrorist attack in American history that led to the death of almost 3,000 U.S. citizens, the Bush administration responded swiftly, declaring a war on terror. This radical shift in foreign policy aimed to, in theory, take preemptive action against future terrorist attacks against America and see the elimination of Al Qaeda and the Taliban. Now, the response from the Bush administration was complicated, and it happened in several steps. Kind of at first, upon gathering the credible intelligence that the attacks had been carried out by Al Qaeda, the initial assumption was that Afghanistan should be the target of priority, considering that the Taliban was the group propping up Al Qaeda. This assumption was warranted. The U.S. would begin its invasion of Afghanistan on October 7th of 2001. So, kind of just basically as a premise, thinking about this, Al Qaeda were the ones that are responsible for the 9/11 attacks. They were being propped up by the Taliban regime, who were in control of Afghanistan at the time. So, kind of using logical reasoning to kind of deduct, it would seem that Afghanistan was the logical target. However, in the days following 9/11, a briefing at Camp David took place, which involved many top officials in the Bush cabinet, which included President Bush himself and Secretary Rumsfeld. In this meeting, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz proposed the idea that Al Qaeda did not act alone and had been propped up by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Wolfowitz further went on to call Hussein's regime the head of the snake in global terrorism. Another advisor in the room quickly dismissed the theory, emphasizing there was no evidence connecting Iraq to Al Qaeda or international terrorism in general. Despite this lack of evidence, Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld persevered to convince Bush that Iraq was a viable target. So, thinking about this as well, you may be thinking, well, why Iraq? Well, that's a great question. And this sort of became a concept of selling the war. The goal was to sell the Iraq War to the American people, even though, in all truth, there was little to no evidence to support any of the claims that the Bush administration made. So, kind of starting off, Bush wanted a decisive victory at all costs. I think you kind of have to think from I don't even want to say think from, but I think you have to kind of contextualize the situation George Bush was in following 9/11. You know, his country had just been attacked under his watch, and I think he probably realized that it would be hard to get a decisive victory against Al Qaeda forces who were hiding out in the mountains of Afghanistan, and he wanted a decisive victory. He wanted to show the American people and show the world really too, that America was still strong and America was still on top. So quickly, this whole propaganda and smearing campaign began, starting with an oppressive Iraqi regime. Now there is a great level of truth to this. Obviously, Saddam Hussein, not the best guy. He was clearly a ruthless dictator, had his political opponents killed, among many other things, and it was clear that people were suffering under his rule. There's no question about that. And then weapons of mass destruction. This is kind of the thing that people bring up the most, and we're going to hear Dick Cheney talk about weapons of mass destruction here shortly. But the big thing with weapons of mass destruction is Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney, everyone in his cabinet really pushed the narrative that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Not only that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but there was conclusive and provable evidence that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And then this further went on to getting the British involved. America went to her allies and kind of tried to convince them that this was a good idea as well. And then it went on to convincing the American people in Congress. This was done in many different ways. And another notable thing to point out on the global stage was Secretary of State Colin Powell's UN testimony at the time. And he asserted very clearly in that testimony that he was giving facts and not opinions, and everything he was saying was backed up by credible intelligence, and he was kind of reiterating some of the things that we're about to listen to Dick Cheney say. But the big problem that he kind of had there, actually later in his career, he would go on to say that Secretary Powell will go on to say that it was a huge mistake, that kind of going up there and reassuring things that weren't facts. So we're just going to quickly watch this Dick Cheney clip here and listen to him talk about justification for the invasion of Iraq.
Simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
All right, we don't need to watch the whole clip, but in essence, you can really see there the clarity and the sureness that Vice President Cheney was speaking with. You know, he's clearly saying they have WMDs. We have proof of this. We have proof that they're giving them to these terrorist organizations, and all of these very bold claims with very little evidence to back them up. So, yeah. So we move on to the Downing Street memo. This would leak years later, but it became a huge piece of controversy kind of throughout all of this. So it was dated July 23rd, 2002. It was a leaked British intelligence document. It's named Downing Street is named after Downing Street, which is where the Prime Minister resides in Britain. Bush and his cabinet had decided to remove Saddam Hussein from power prematurely. So this is really a huge aspect of it. You have to, you know, in order for a president to declare war, he needs the approval of Congress. And in theory, if he needs the approval of Congress, he also needs the approval of the people. Now, Bush absolutely did not have the approval of Congress at this time, and he was still, him and his cabinet had definitively decided that they were going to invade Iraq and that they were going to topple Saddam Hussein from power no matter what. And this to me, this quote right here on the next line, is the most important line of the entire memo when it says intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. So that very clearly tells us as outside observers that the Bush administration was fabricating information and was using information to fit their narratives about how they felt about Iraq. And we see this with the British officials. They express great concern over the legality of this war. And as I said, thin evidence at best. We've kind of gone over that. But at the time, no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And again, military planning had been underway for months, despite no approval from the international community, no approval from Congress. And then there was a lack of a stability plan post-war. So kind of this idea was like, oh, America, we're going to go in and get this big decisive victory, but there was no plan for it after. You know, who's going to rule? You know, what's it going to look like? Is it going to be a democracy? And yeah, in essence, this document was leaked in May 2005, and at that point it did develop the alternative name of the smoking gun memo, which is kind of used by critics of Bush and his administration to show that clearly there was a lot of evidence fabrication, propaganda, and manipulation going on. Despite all this, obviously this memo didn't come out, and clearly Bush's tactics worked, because on October 10th of 2002, Congress voted in favor of taking military action against Iraq. On March 20th of the following year, American and coalition forces would launch the invasion of Iraq. And I think you have this famous picture here in the bottom right of Saddam Hussein's statue being torn down. There was actually a big controversy over the flag being put on him and stuff. We don't need to talk about that. But the bigger one here is that picture of Bush is from that famous speech where he says, we've landed in Iraq, we're there to free its people, and it really it was really a crazy message for the time. And then we kind of move on here to the aftermath. So we won't cover the invasion here in particular, but in the aftermath of it, the Iraq Survey Group, or ISG, conducted a thorough investigation with over 1,000 experts. Now, this wasn't, they were actively searching the country for weapons, for anything of concern. I mean, they were scanning the grounds, they were overturning things, and these were top experts who knew what they were looking for when it came to nuclear weapons. Now, the ISG, upon the conclusion of the investigation, definitively concluded that Iraq did not possess WMDs at the time of the invasion. Additionally, the 9/11 Commission report determined that neither Saddam Hussein nor his regime had any ties to Al-Qaeda or any Islamic extremist groups. In essence, all exaggerated or outright fabricated intelligence that the Bush administration used to justify the invasion of Iraq was proven false or misinterpreted. While Saddam was a ruthless dictator, there's no question about that, his regime had no role whatsoever in 9/11 or global terrorism as a whole. And while many Iraqis feel life is better without Saddam, the nation faces many political, social, and economic hardships to this day. And this is obviously a very controversial topic. There was a war and there was a lot of destruction, but I think a good way to kind of close all this out is to ask, why does this matter and why is this really important? Well, this was clearly an unjustified and illegal war. There was no precedent for or legal reason for the Bush administration to sell this war. The Iraq had no involvement in 9/11. They had no involvement in terrorism. They had no clear link to any adversaries of, I guess the best way to put it is they pose no clear and immediate threat to the United States that would have justified an invasion. And this is where we really get into the consequences of the decisions that the Bush administration made. An estimated 460,000 Iraqi citizens died during the war or resulting from complications related to it, and millions more were displaced. I mean, it was a destructive war, as you can kind of see here in the picture in the top right. There was a lot of villages, towns flattened. It was terrible. But additionally, over 4,500 U.S. soldiers also did die in the conflict. And the U.S. spent about $2 trillion on the war. Now, I know, obviously, the U.S. is known for spending a lot of money on its military, but when you think $2 trillion in context of where else that money could have gone to and how else it could have been better used, as opposed to implementing regime change in a nation that posed no true threat at the moment. And then you have regional instability and the rise of ISIS. So because of what happened in Iraq, there was regional instability for years to an extent there still is, and that kind of left a huge power vacuum, which allowed ISIS to kind of come in and actually did cause, obviously, a notable terrorist group is what I'm trying to say. But kind of the big piece tying this all together, you have foreign policy implication, and the U.S. is the leader of the Western world. So obviously, the U.S. Is no stranger to implementing regime changes. You can think back to Chile in 1973, Nicaragua through the Banana War. I mean, there's a ton of examples. I couldn't sit here and name all of them for you. But really, the big thing with foreign policy is this absolutely tainted the image of America on the global stage, who had painted itself as this beacon of freedom and the leader of the Western world and the leader of the Western order. And to have this stain on that reputation was clearly absolutely devastating. And it just put the U.S. in a different position. And it kind of, and especially when you put it in context of the war in Afghanistan, which went on for 20 years and didn't even successfully change the regime there. You think about the trillions and trillions of dollars that have been dumped into the military-industrial complex that kind of stem from the Iraq War and obviously the events of 9/11. But I think when you think about all these things in context, it's really important to remember that this wasn't justified, and there's no evidence to suggest that in any way was this war justified. And kind of, I guess, to end things on a personal note, I just think that I think that the actions of this administration, well, I don't necessarily believe that every single person in Bush's cabinet or Bush himself necessarily always had the worst intentions throughout all this. I think it is absolutely unquestionable that evidence was fabricated, evidence was exaggerated, intelligence was exaggerated, and it was the primary goal of the Bush administration to sell a war to the American people and to the world that it had already made its mind up on. But that's the entire presentation. Got the works cited here. Thanks for watching. See you next time.